Hallo, mein Name ist Christiane Wirz. Ich bin Coach und Autorin aus Köln und weiß, wie sich etwas aus Krisen machen lässt. Herzlich willkommen. Heute bin ich sehr aufgeregt und ich freue mich furchtbar. Und ich fühle mich tatsächlich geehrt. Das ist jetzt echt kein Spruch, weil unser heutiger Podcast-Gast, der Podcast wird auch auf Englisch sein, ist der niederländische Professor für, ich sage es auf Englisch gleich, Professor of Psychiatric Epidemiology and Public Mental Health am Utrecht University Medical Center. Professor Jim van Aus. Und Jim van Aus ist nicht nur ein fantastischer Wissenschaftler, sondern auch jemand, der durchaus mal etwas sagt, was man heute sagen würde, was disruptiv ist. Wir sprechen jetzt eben gleich auf Englisch und Professor van Aus ist auch TED-Speaker gewesen mit seinen Thesen und es ist natürlich auch irgendwie Wasser auf meine Mühlen, denn es geht um Mental Health, ist ganz klar. Aber es geht um ein ganz spezielles Konzept, nämlich die Schizophrenie. Und jetzt auf Englisch. Welcome, Professor Aus. I'm really Van Aus. I'm really delighted that you're here and honored by that. And you speak words that do me good. You challenge the concept of schizophrenia, and you have good reasons for that. What are these reasons, and why do you think that it has to rethought?
Well, first, Christiane, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm very happy to be in your podcast. You're an established author, and your name is very well known in the Netherlands as well as a force of empowerment and experience that we need. So. With regard to your question, I think this is I like the debate about schizophrenia because it lays bare the core issue of why psychiatry is so culturally biased and in many regards unscientific and unwilling to set things straight. So schizophrenia is sort of core of psychiatry. It's the flagship diagnosis. It is the diagnosis we thought would help us discover the biology of mental illness and would lead to medical fixes and great prestige for our profession. And the interesting thing is that with progress in science and epidemiology, but also with the narratives of people with lived experience, we have actually discovered that this notion of schizophrenia is scientifically not valid. What we have seen is that, if you like, mental variation can take on many, many different forms and shapes. You can feel anxious, or you can have low mood, or you can attribute significance to the environment in a special way. These are all core human mental processes. And, with anxiety, that's quite clear. If you say, I've got an anxiety problem, people will know, oh, his anxiety is my anxiety. I know where you're coming from. And then sometimes, the way we attribute meaning to the environment, like if things are threatening, or if our mental processes are strange to us, these can have forms that we say, I feel there's too many red cars around me in the street. I feel very threatened by the presence of, red cars, and why are they following me, etc. These are core human mental processes. And what we have done for this type of mental variation, we have invented a word that is sort of a Greek word, meaning split mind, that's got nothing to do with the mental experience itself. It doesn't help explain why this is a core human mental process that everybody can have to a degree, so that nobody can compare it to his or her own mental process. So you alienate, you make people strange in the eyes of other people, and ununderstandable. So that was a core mistake, I think. call people something that nobody understands and is basically not more than a complicated Greek word. But then the second thing is that psychosis really is about altered attributional, processes or attributing meaning to the environment in a way that other people don't understand. There's many forms of psychosis, and it's really a spectrum of experiences. And it's a spectrum that you can also pick up in the general population. It's a bit like anxiety and depression and autism. We now accept that these are expressions on a spectrum of mental experience that you can measure in the general population as well as in people who have difficulties with these experiences. And we call them patients. But psychosis is the same thing. Psychosis is a core human mental variation of attributing meaning to the environment that sometimes sometimes is highly idiosyncratic, so that other people do not exactly understand what you mean. But it's a core human psychological process. And what we have done is we have elevated a normal spectrum of human variation to a illness that we call a complicated Greek word, and that has become associated with brain disease, poor prognosis, ununderstandable, dangerous, and above all requiring lifelong medical treatment with antipsychotics. And this is very strange, because if you look at it scientifically, we do not only have schizophrenia, because we have also invented schizophrenia, schizophreniform disorder, schizoaffective disorder, schizoid personality disorder, schizotypal personality disorder, delusional disorder, psychosis not otherwise specified. We've identified 13 different diagnoses of psychotic variation, but the only thing we ever talk about is schizophrenia. But then if you look at it, what happens in clinical practice, we see that only about a third of patients who have something with psychosis, only a third gets the label of schizophrenia, and the other 70% get other diagnoses like schizoaffective or schizophreniform or delusional or whatever. But we have reserved schizophrenia for the group with a relatively poor prognosis compared to the other 70%. But what has happened is that since we only talk about schizophrenia, 95% of our research is about schizophrenia, not about the other 70% with milder forms of psychosis. So the whole of psychosis spectrum has become associated with this poor outcome, brain-based, antipsychotic requiring illness. So the experience of psychosis has become contaminated with a very pessimistic biological notion of mental illness, which is scientifically clearly wrong, because we've done 50 years of intensive biological research. 50 years. We've done neuroimaging. We've done hormonal examinations. We've done electrophysiological examinations. We've done genetic examinations of schizophrenia and the spectrum of psychosis. And we have found absolutely nothing. And that's the really interesting thing scientifically. The scientific most important finding with regard to tying the diagnosis of schizophrenia to biology has been that we have no clinical useful correlation with any measure of biology. So, for example, a good example is genetics. Let's take genetics. So what happens if you compare 500,000 controls with 200,000 patients, and you compare, say, 7 million pieces of genetic variation between these two groups? What we have found is we have signals. We found genetic signals that are more common in the patient group compared to the control group. But, here's the big but, there are literally thousands of genetic differences between patients and controls, but they are tiny, they are minute. And the really interesting thing is that the contrast is not very impressive, because every human being has hundreds to thousands of these genetic variants. So we have found that there is a genetic contribution to the liability of psychosis, but every human being has it. We all have genetic liability for psychosis, and this is logical because psychosis is the faculty of attributing meaning to the environment, which is to a small degree genetically influenced. So the liability for psychosis is to 20%, 25% has a genetic influence. Well, big deal, Every human characteristic has a genetic contribution, but the most important thing is that all human beings, that's the most important biological finding, is that we all have genetic liability for schizophrenia. Schizophrenia, therefore, is the human condition, is part of the human condition. Psychosis is part of the human condition. That is the real scientific finding. So then, if I may go on, because what is interesting then, if we don't have biological findings that you can really tie in a clinical useful manner to people with psychotic experiences, what does that mean? And we are starting to think scientifically that the hypothesis that our mental variation is somehow embedded in our biology, perhaps is a bad hypothesis. Because when you come to think of it, why would my preference for the color yellow over the color red be genetically determined? Or why would me falling in love with person A but not person B? Why would that sort of mental preference be genetically determined? Why would that be a good hypothesis? So the hypothesis that each and every thought and feeling and attribution of the environment is embedded in our biology, maybe that's a very bad hypothesis. Because you can also, for example, think, well, if I am sad, if I have a core emotion of sadness, of course, I then maybe I will see the environment differently, and I will see more threat in the environment. So what I mean to say is one mental phenomenon, like a feeling, can cause another mental phenomenon, namely how you perceive the environment. And that can in turn cause another mental phenomenon, namely that you start to feel threatened by another person that you see nearby, or that you think something special of red cars. So there may be part of the mental variation that we see in humans is part of a chain of mental events, one mental event causing another mental event. And the interesting thing of mentality of mental events is that they're not material. You can't measure them under the microscope. They're immaterial. They're not in the physical domain. So it looks nice saying mental illness is a brain disease, but when you come to think of it, it's infinitely more complicated, really. So the whole idea is unscientific. And then you come also to the question then, well, okay, why would we tell people they've got a brain disease then? And why would we tell them to take antipsychotics for the rest of their lives? What is the science behind that?
Yeah, I thank you very much for this concept, for this new concept that you developed since 15 years nearly, no? More or less, step by step.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm allowed to say that, but my impression is that, of course, there are biological aspects as well as genetic aspects, as well as, I don't know, whatever, lifestyle aspects and nutrition aspects and all these things. But maybe, anyway, the future of psychiatry could be consciousness. How to develop mastery of your mind and also integrate your feelings. I mean, like not thinking that you have to be a robot or artificial intelligence or whatever, but to integrate these things and to make research on consciousness. I just wanted to, because I'm in talks with also with people, as well as with shamans, or I don't know how you say that in English, with people who try to bring this psychedelics experiences into the discussion. What do you think about these, let's say, new approaches to mental and consciousness topics?
So I think this is very important. Because it represents a fundamental change. So to date, what everybody agrees on is that if you look at the mind and the brain, that they have a relationship, but the relationship is conditional in the sense that they may be two parts of the same thing. That's called the identity theory. But everybody intuits that they have something. But the brain may be conditional for mind activity. But that's what psychiatry is saying is that the brain causes the mind. So each and every aspect of the mind is caused by brain activity, but that's entirely different. And it doesn't leave room for a science of the mental, a science of mental activity by itself. But I think now what we're saying is the implicit model of psychiatry is, people are their brain, therefore a person with schizophrenia is his sick brain. He gets identified with the sick brain. I think we're now saying, no, we need also a science of the mental, and consciousness is really saying we are going to take serious the fact that we do not understand the exact relationship between brain and mind. Therefore, we need to empower the science of the mind as something of itself. And a science of the mental then becomes very interesting, because we know that if you take that seriously, that people will tell you literally what other cultures have been studying for a long time, that many aspects of learning to live with mental variation and mental problems is like learning how to, as it were, make a transcendent leap past your immediate mental experience and be able to look at it from a little bit of a distance, which sometimes you can do with the aid of transcendental meditation or taking ayahuasca type of psychedelics. But I think that's very, very interesting, because many people will tell you that what they've learned in dealing with mental problems is not, they go through a phase that they call it an illness and that they take medication and that they learn to view it as a medical problem. And then they decide, no, let's do something else. And let's not talk about it and see it cognitively as a disease, but try to examine it from the mental. So, for example, they go to explore bodily experiences. They do bodily therapies, or they do psychedelic therapies, or they try to reach transcendental mental states that allow them to explore their own mind from a distance, make journeys, very interesting. And then they come back, and without us knowing exactly what has happened, they are able to take a different perspective on their suffering, on their mental experiences in a way that makes life bearable, and that also allows them to see a future again. So I think consciousness, like the hard problem of consciousness, like Chalmers called it in 1995, that we still haven't solved, I think the hard problem of consciousness should not be ignored anymore in psychiatry. We should embrace it and make it part of our practice, and also then empower ourselves to also create a science of the mind without treating the mind as a sort of byproduct of the biological brain that hasn't any interest in itself apart from seeing it as symptoms. So if we take the mind seriously and consciousness seriously, transcendental consciousness theory and how people are able to create perspectives in their mind that can be helpful, not cognitively, but through exploration of bodily experiences, psychedelic experiences, etc. And that's what we see coming. So that's good. But there's also a less desirable thing, and that is that pharmaceutical industries now start promoting things like ketamine as the next depression treatment. But in a way that I think is very dangerous, because psychedelics like ketamine can also have very important side effects. You know, if you want to play around with psychedelics, that's fine, but just calling it a treatment for depression and say it's safe to use without exploring the side effects, because there have been suicides in these trials, and the trial methodology. So you get another sort of pharmaceutical boom within the old medical model of psychiatry, using these medications. And I don't think that's not a good idea. If you use them, you should use them in a new model of psychiatry.
I want to add two things. The one thing is that these moments that you can watch yourself, or you can take a different perspective. This actually happened to me when I was in the psychiatric clinic in 2016, because then I thought, oh my gosh, what did you do with your gifts until now? I mean, this was not a very critical voice, let's say, in myself. But this was something like, come on, girl, do something. You shouldn't, cry the whole life through what was not okay in your life, or was maybe I have cried about that. Okay, so but maybe this should be enough now, and I should start now to do something. And this was a little bit like a spiritual moment, if you want to say so. And my personal approach to psychedelics is, I had an experience, but I thought, this is not my way. I mean, this is not, if, for example, you're coming from Peru or I don't know, wherever, and you're using ayahuasca or whoever wants to do that, it's fine. But it's not my way, because I thought, I want to master these things. I want to master the borders between the one thing and the other one. I want to master the transitions, and then I don't have a psychosis anyway. Because if I'm grounded in myself, I don't want to say grounded like I eat something or I have a lot of money, and I mean this contributes to that. But if I'm centered in myself, in my body, and I could have crazy thoughts. These crazy thoughts can contribute to my everyday life, of course. They are these different perspectives. They are these ideas that come. I just have to master that. I have to focus a little bit. I have to master that. That was just, I thought, what I have to do. And let's say step by step, because more or less I'm living 15 years with psychotropics and stuff. So I should, slow down a little bit with and not throwing them away in the deepest crisis. But this was my conclusion after that happened. And but not everybody wants to believe me. Okay, and not it's also not, it's not the solution for everybody, of course. But I understand.
So, but that's why your story is so, I think, so interesting and powerful, because that is what, if you analyze the stories of people with lived experience and how they've come to cope with whatever variation and diversity they had, is what you described. They describe what is called turning points. Turning points are like what you described, that often they have the form of, I was in a psychiatric hospital, I was cutting myself for 5 years, I had negative voices, until I met somebody who said ... And then they describe a change in perspective, a turning point, often of a spiritual character, of a deeply felt, invasive character that was contributing to change. And the thing is that the turning points are not linear, and you can't exactly create them when you want to. It is the end point of very hard work and much suffering, but they are described in synthesis of the narratives of people with lived experience. These turning points are very powerful. And what also is very powerful is the way people experience their mind as out of balance, and trying to find a balance. And this is also very interesting because our mind is constantly fluctuating between the positive, the negative, and the alertness and the sleepiness. And we know that the experience of mental suffering is probably when there's lack of balance, like that the negative is so disproportional to the positive that the usual sense of balance is gone. And what people describe, like you have described, is, well, why can't these two then be brought in balance again alongside each other? Like, the craziness or the negativeness or the self-hate or whatever it is people suffer with. Why can't we still have that, but more compartmentalized or integrated in a way that I can still continue to see a future and live my life? And maybe even have something powerful deriving from it that helps me in daily life and help other people. So why not listen to these stories and then try to work with each other along these lines? And that is, in fact, what now people with lived experience, they're now working increasingly in the mental health service. Indeed, they are transforming the mental health service to such a degree that in the Netherlands, my country, we see a sort of a parallel mental health service of recovery colleges run by people with lived experience, but not in the health service, but in the social care service. And they don't work with diagnoses. They work with an educational model. They say, once you've been in a mental crisis, you need an education, a training. And we have a college where you are taught literally how to find your balance again and how to get perspective again and make sense of your life and see a future. And these are very popular places. And the interesting thing is now, is this the way it should be? Like, you have a formal mental health service that works with diagnoses and medications, and then you have another mental health service that works with a lived experience educational model of mental problems. I think we should integrate with each other so that we should listen more to the narratives and other ways of working. But we can still, if people want to try molecules, we can say, well, we got a bunch of molecules you can try. Some people have benefit with medication, although you probably not use them for a long time. They can help you, sometimes get a change in perspective as well. Or you can use, other areas of therapy that we have some experience in. But then we have a different model of working. We are serving the educational model rather than being the power structure of defining that is defining what mental variation is and call it illness and draw people into a biological model that in the end will disempower them rather than help them.
You talked about the Netherlands. What can you tell us about the developments in other countries, like in the United States, which might be important as
yes.
whatever? And but what about other approaches from other countries outside the European Union?
Yeah. So I think the United States is a very interesting country because in the United States you always see everything that is extremely underdeveloped and everything that is extremely overdeveloped. So in terms of new models of mental health care, there are very, very interesting experiments taking place in the United States. For example, you have communities in the United States paid for by Medicare-type structures of people with lived experience taking care of other people with mental problems, and not just helping people to deal with the problems, but also for housing, education, work. And the interesting thing of the United States is that the country where people with a history of mental illness work the most is the United States. Whereas in Europe, once you've had a mental crisis, you're out. It's very difficult to get in again. But not in the United States. That's the interesting thing. Our welfare system is wonderful, but it also brings a number of problems. But the United States, of course, is also the country where academic psychiatry, where the pillar of academic psychiatry is the brain causes mind model of mental illness. And very conservative psychiatrists who say, well, all this recovery movement is a hoax. You can say that as an academic psychiatrist in the US. You can just say it's a hoax, and really we are the boss and we help people. So that's what I find interesting about the United States. The United, in general, you see the psychiatric, but also the psychological professions struggling with, what is coming next, more than the rest of medicine. But you could say it applies to the whole of medicine. The whole of medicine is very much a medical profession that is trying to change medical outcomes, but is not trying to impact people's lives. They're worried about their own technical outcomes rather than helping people. But psychiatry and psychology, because psychologists have become very medical in their outlook, they've become even more brain-based than the psychiatrists. They are struggling with what is next. And I think the newer generation of psychiatrists and psychologists are much more flexible, I think, in accepting mental variation as such. They see the science that all these diagnoses are not very helpful because they overlap and they change. And they're more comfortable in talking to people, being flexible, adaptive, working alongside people with lived experience, and embracing human diversity as a model of psychiatry. So I'm very hopeful that say, the older generation like myself are sort of gradually die out and will be replaced by a younger, much more flexible generation.
What I find very helpful with the US view is this general mentality of okay, you fell. You can have my hand, and because tomorrow you can be somebody else. So this here in Europe, or maybe at least in Germany, is a little bit like, oh my God. I mean, like, okay, I had that. Okay, and I'm also working with that, and I'm interested in that. I think it's a very interesting phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that, for example, in this time right now, it's one of the most helpful. If you're really getting close and near and really see all the parts of the puzzle, if you see all the parts of the puzzle, it's a clue to what's happening right now. These changing world. I mean, like you have phenomenons like people with who are regarded as not ill and who are paranoid. Or you have people who are completely afraid, and you just can't console them right now. And also it's affecting science. I mean, like in this respect, regarding Corona, you see the same. You see there is sometimes a lack of objectivity. I mean, like, not maybe in what's happening in the numbers, but a lack of objectivity in what to do and how to interpret them. And you have a problem between, in this range of people interpreting them differently, and they are very, it reminds me of the 30-jährige Krieg. They're not tolerant. Yeah. And they don't want to work with each other. Yeah.
So I think that's spot on. So I think, and in psychiatry, it's probably even more potent because we don't understand the brain-mind relationship. There's so much we do not know, and if there's a lot of not knowing, then what you do is you create a culture to fill the gap of what you don't know, and culture means that you're very much attached to it. So you fill the gaps where you don't know things. You tell people a story. This is how it really is. The brain causes the mind, and there's illness, and there's mental illness and brain-based illnesses. And then you get very attached to that culture, which then impedes you to work with other people who have alternative models or new scientific developments, because you have this cultural bias that you pretend is a scientific reality.
Yes. But on the other hand, I feel that maybe this corona thing helps people with mental health, whatever issues, to be accepted, because I think that more or less everybody in the lockdown times, they really suffered not being with their friends, with their family, not going out, not having the possibility to go out, no work, no, being completely with themselves more or less sometimes.
Yes, certainly. That's what we hear here as well. A lot of people feel that you're in the same boat. You get a feeling like we're all in the same boat, and it's connecting everybody, and that can be helpful indeed. Mm-hmm.
So, Jim, do you want to? Usually, I'm ending this podcast with a good advice from the one that was my guest. Usually, the podcast is about a story, of a personal story, but this is a special podcast this time. But maybe you have a good advice for, let's put it in general, for people with mental health issues, whatever, or let's say psychosis issues. What would you advise them?
Well, we have this website called psychoses.nl, and we have a lot of people coming there, and they ask questions. They can ask a panel of 20 people questions, and I get like 10 questions a day. And I find that one of the most important things, I think, to help people, and what we try to convey on the website, is to tell people, see yourself as a human being with mental variation that is telling you something. See it as something that has meaning, that you can talk about to other people, find the meaning, and work with that meaning, although it can be very hard and very difficult. But don't think it is just a symptom of a brain disease, because once you do that, you're in a sort of a hopeless situation, because that means somebody else with knowledge about the brain you don't have is supposed to come and fix you. But we know from decades and decades of research that is not how it works. It works like you take ownership of your mental variation. You don't get distracted by all these diagnoses and models. Do something with it, and let yourself be advised by other people who've been there and know what they talk about when they have lived experience, and do the work. And sure, you can try molecules, and you can try psychotherapy, and you can try meditation. Try to find what works for you. And there's a lot of things you can do. And I think, that usually helps people get a more workable model of recovery than the ones they usually get in when they meet mental health professionals and diagnosis-based systems.
So thank you very much, Jim van Os. I was really glad for this very interesting conversation. I will switch to German to finish this podcast. Vielen herzlichen Dank, Jim van Os, dass Sie hier Gast bei dem Podcast waren. Das ist jetzt ein Spezial-Podcast dieses Mal. Es ging jetzt diesmal nicht um Jims Geschichte, sondern um Jims Wissen. In den nächsten 2 Wochen sehen wir uns wieder mit einer Podcast-Folge, die wieder so ein bisschen breiter gestreut sein wird vom Thema her. Also wir beschäftigen uns ja nicht immer mit dem Thema Psychose und Schizophrenie, aber es war einfach so eine tolle Gelegenheit, Jim van Os zu interviewen, und ich hoffe, es hat euch auch gefallen, es interessiert euch, und es interessiert hoffentlich auch die mit Psychosen eigentlich nicht so ganz was zu tun haben, denn das ist wirklich interessant. Und wie gesagt, wir sehen uns in 2 Wochen. Ich bedanke mich bei euch und freue mich, euch dann eben wieder mit euch in Kontakt zu sein. Bis dann. Tschüss.